The city bus groaned to life before sunrise, its engine coughing in the cool gray of the morning. Darnell Hayes sat behind the wheel, hands resting lightly on the steering column, his uniform pressed but worn at the cuffs. For 12 years, he had driven Route 27, the same line from the east side neighborhoods to the downtown terminal. He could trace it in his sleep. Every pothole, every light that lingered too long, every passenger who boarded like clockwork. The city didn't know him. To most, he was just the driver. But to the regulars, he was a part of their mornings. He knew Mrs. Lopez, who always carried 2 bags of groceries and a tired smile. He knew the high school kids who piled in with headphones and yawns, and the nurse Zoe, who caught the 6:15 every morning after a long night shift. "Morning, Mrs. Zoe," he said, as she climbed aboard, her eyes heavy but grateful. "Morning, Darnell," she answered, swiping her card. "Coffee's the only reason I'm standing." He chuckled, guiding the bus smoothly back into traffic. "One of these days, I'll keep a pot right up here for you." She laughed softly before sinking into her seat, and for a moment, the bus felt like a community, a moving patchwork of lives that overlapped only here, in the rumble of steel and the hiss of brakes. But outside that world, Darnell was invisible. At the transit office, city officials glanced past him, more concerned with charts and cost reports than the man who kept their buses running on time. Complaints about cracked seats or late arrivals always landed on his desk, even when the issues were out of his control. Suggestions he submitted: fix the brake lines on bus number 142, repair the flickering stoplight at 8th and Main, repaint the faded crosswalk near the school, were shuffled into files that no one read. At times, it felt deliberate. Other times, just careless. Either way, he was never heard. One Friday morning, a commuter in a sharp suit boarded, phone pressed to his ear. He brushed past Darnell without so much as a glance, muttering, "Took you long enough to get here." Darnell bit back a sigh. He'd left the depot on time, hit every stop at schedule. Still, to riders like that, the bus wasn't a lifeline. It was an inconvenience. And he, the driver, was just part of the machine. As he steered the lumbering vehicle past the river, the rising sun streaked the water gold. He thought of his father, who had worked the city's sanitation trucks for 30 years. "A job like this," his father used to say, "you do it with pride even if no one thanks you. Because they don't see the work, but they'd see it real quick if you weren't there." Darnell carried those words like armor. Still, the weight of invisibility pressed harder each year. That morning, as the bus hissed to a stop at the downtown terminal, he watched his passengers scatter into the rush of the city. Not one looked back. Not one saw the man behind the wheel, steady hands guiding them through another morning. He closed the doors, sat for a moment in the sudden silence, and whispered to himself, "Another day. Just keep driving." He didn't know it yet, but soon, the city that ignored him would have no choice but to see him. The following Monday, Darnell sat in the depot's small break room, sipping weak coffee from a styrofoam cup. The walls were covered with faded safety posters. "Report mechanical issues immediately, and always check your brakes." He had reported mechanical issues dozens of times. Nothing ever changed. He rubbed his temples, staring at the latest inspection sheet for bus number 142. In neat block letters, he had written, "Brakes soft. Stopping distance increased. Needs service ASAP." The sheet sat in a metal tray on the dispatcher's desk, right where he'd left the last 3. He knew it would sit there until the ink faded. When the dispatcher finally came in, late as usual, he barely glanced at the sheet. "Morning, Hayes. That your bus out back?" "Yes, sir." "Good. She's due out in 10. You'll manage." Darnell bit his tongue. Manage. That was always the word. Not fix it, not we'll check. Just manage. He thought of the school kids who climbed aboard every morning, of Zoe dozing in the back after her night shifts. His passengers trusted him with their lives, and the city trusted him with duct tape and prayers. That week, the complaints started coming. Not about the brakes or the peeling paint or the broken stoplight he'd reported 6 times. No, the complaints were about him. Karen Whitfield, a council member who occasionally rode his route, was the first to file one. Her letter, printed on official stationery, read, "Driver on Route 27 is unprofessional. Talks too much to passengers, slowing his schedule. Drives overly cautious, likely to frustrate commuters. His demeanor is more suited to a tour bus than city transit. Darnell read the copy pinned to the bulletin board and felt heat rise in his chest. Overly cautious. He drove with care because his brakes were soft. He talked to passengers because they were human beings, not cargo. 2 days later, another complaint followed. This time, bus driver failed to arrive on time. Darnell checked his watch logs. He'd been exactly 3 minutes late, stuck behind a traffic jam caused by a broken light he'd already reported. By Friday, his supervisor called him into the office. The man's tone was weary, almost rehearsed. Look, Hayes, we've been getting some feedback. The council's not happy. Try to keep chatter down, pick up the pace a little. Darnell folded his hands on his lap. Sir, with respect, the brakes on 142 are failing. If I drive any faster, I'm putting lives at risk. The supervisor waved a hand dismissively. Maintenance is backed up. Just do your best. Don't make waves. Don't make waves. Darnell heard that phrase all the way back to his first year on the job, when he'd suggested new mirrors for blind spots. Every time it was the same. The city cared more about silence than safety. That evening, as he drove his route, Darnell kept his eyes on the road, jaw tight. Mrs. Lopez boarded with her groceries, giving him her tired smile. The kids piled in with their headphones. Zoe settled into her usual seat, and the bus rumbled along like it always had. To them, he was steady, dependable, invisible. But to the city, he was a problem. Not because he failed them, but because he dared to care. As the bus rolled past the river, Darnell gripped the wheel tighter, whispering to himself, one day they'll listen. One day. He had no idea how soon that day would come. The letter arrived in a thin white envelope, tucked into his time card slot at the depot. Darnell tore it open with calloused fingers, already dreading what he'd find. A notice of performance review. Due to multiple community concerns and council complaints, your conduct and fitness as a city bus driver are under review. Further incidents may result in disciplinary action, including suspension or termination. The words blurred for a moment as he stared at them, his jaw locked tight. Community concerns. That was Karen's voice, he knew it. Her binder, her clipped tone, her complaints dressed up as official policy. 12 years of spotless service, of early mornings and late nights, of steady hands keeping passengers safe, reduced to a single sheet of paper. He folded the letter carefully, slid it into his lunch pail, and headed out to his bus. That day, his passengers felt the difference. He still greeted them, but the warmth in his voice was quieter, guarded. Zoe climbed aboard, her eyes narrowing at his subdued tone. You okay, Darnell? She asked. Just peachy, he said, forcing a smile. How's Saint? Barnabas treating you? She didn't press, but she gave him a look, the kind that said, I know something's wrong. Mrs. Lopez, with her bags of groceries, noticed too. You're quieter today, she murmured, easing into her seat. Not like you. Darnell just nodded and focused on the road. At the next stop, a man in a suit boarded, glancing at his watch. Finally, he muttered loud enough for the whole bus to hear. Driver must think we've got nowhere to be. Darnell kept his voice calm. Traffic light's been out on Main. I've reported it. The man scoffed, shaking his head as he stalked to the back. Complaints, Darnell thought. Always complaints. As the bus rolled on, he caught sight of the inspection sticker peeling at the corner of the windshield. Expired. Another thing he'd flagged. Another thing ignored. That evening, after his last run, he sat alone in the depot's break room. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The vending machine rattled in the corner. He pulled out the letter again and read it slowly, the words like weights pressing down on him. Under review. Not for failing his route, not for endangering passengers, but for being too cautious, too chatty, too visible. His father's words came back to him. They don't see the work, son, but they'd see it real quick if you weren't there. Darnell leaned back, staring at the ceiling. What's it gonna take? He whispered. The answer was closer than he knew. Within days, the very brakes he'd warned about would give way, and the city that ignored him would finally see who he was. It was a Thursday afternoon, humid and restless, the kind of day when the city seemed to lean heavy on itself. The school bell had just released a flood of students, and bus number 142 was nearly full. Teenagers with backpacks spilling into the aisles, Mrs. Lopez with her groceries tucked at her feet, Zoe slumped near the front after another overnight shift, and a handful of office workers tapping at phones. Darnell eased the bus onto the downtown bridge, the river glinting below. The engine hummed, brakes sighing as they always did. He kept one hand steady on the wheel, eyes flicking from mirror to mirror. It was routine, until it wasn't. As the bus began descending the long slope toward the intersection, Darnell tapped the brake. Nothing. No slowing, no hiss of air. Just dead weight. He pressed harder. Still nothing. The pedal sank under his boot, like it was falling into the floor. Not today, he muttered, heart kicking against his ribs. The bus picked up speed, its heavy body rushing forward. Ahead, traffic clogged the intersection. Cars idling, a delivery truck turning left, pedestrians waiting to cross. Passengers began to sense it too. A child screamed. Someone shouted, "We're not slowing down!" Chaos ignited. Groceries spilled across the aisle, phones dropped, people clutched seatbacks with white knuckles. Zoe, jolted awake, braced herself against the window. Darnell's voice cut through the panic, steady and commanding, the way he'd learned to sound in emergencies. "Everybody hold on! Stay low! Stay calm!" With both hands gripping the wheel, he scanned the options. No space to swerve into traffic, no time to stop normally. His eyes locked on the narrow strip of emergency lane hugging the guardrail, a razor-thin margin between safety and the river below. "Come on, old girl," he whispered to the bus. He yanked the wheel gently but firmly, guiding the vehicle into the lane. The right side scraped hard against the guardrail, the steel shrieking, sparks flying in bursts as the metal groaned. The whole bus shuddered, passengers thrown against their seats. But the friction slowed them, foot by grinding foot. The smell of burning rubber filled the cabin, acrid and sharp. The sound was deafening, tires squealing, steel screaming. Darnell kept his body steady, muscles taut, eyes forward. He didn't flinch. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the bus lurched to a stop just feet from the intersection. The world went silent, but for the hiss of the overworked engine and the ragged breaths of 50 passengers. For a moment, no one moved. Then, the cabin erupted. Cries of relief, shaky laughter, sobs. A child clapped her hands as if cheering after a roller coaster. Zoe staggered to her feet, staring at Darnell. You just saved us." He exhaled slowly, gripping the wheel until his knuckles ached. His shirt clung to his back with sweat, his heart still pounding. But his voice, when it came, was calm. "Everybody okay? Anyone hurt?" Heads shook. Voices murmured no. Passengers exchanged looks, terror melting into awe. Outside, drivers honked, pedestrians stared, and within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance. Police, paramedics, city officials, they would all descend soon, notebooks ready, questions sharp. But inside the bus, there was only one truth. The man the city ignored had just saved 50 lives with nothing but steady hands, instinct, and grit. And for the first time in years, every eye in that bus was on him. The bus sat on the shoulder of the bridge like a wounded beast, its sides streaked with gouges from the guardrail. Red and blue lights flashed against its windows as paramedics checked passengers, who stood huddled in small groups, still shaky but alive. Reporters arrived almost as quickly as emergency crews. A local news van screeched to a stop, cameras already rolling, microphones pushed through the crowd. What happened? Was anyone hurt? How did you stop? Darnell stood to the side, leaning against the bus, his uniform damp with sweat, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He had spent years being overlooked. But now, passengers pointed to him again and again. "He saved us," Mrs. Lopez said firmly. Her groceries spilled but forgotten. If he hadn't kept control, we'd all be in the river right now. A teenager, voice cracking with excitement, pulled up a video on his phone. The shaky recording showed the moment Darnell shouted, "Everybody hold on!" and the grinding screech as the bus dragged itself against the rail. The clip spread faster than the sirens could fade, uploaded to social media before the tow truck even arrived. That night, city officials held a press conference in front of the depot. The transit director, sweating under the lights, tried to stay composed. "This was an unfortunate mechanical failure," he said stiffly. "We are grateful no lives were lost. Maintenance protocols will be reviewed." A reporter cut him off. "What about the driver? Witnesses say he saved dozens of lives." The director hesitated, then nodded once. His words clipped. "The driver followed procedure." Darnell, standing behind the crowd, felt the dismissal like a stone to the chest. Followed procedure? There was no procedure for what had happened. He had acted on instinct, on experience, on the warnings no one had listened to. But then a passenger shouted from the side, "He's a hero!" Others chimed in, cheers, applause, voices calling his name. The director's words were swallowed by the sound of gratitude echoing across the lot. By morning, the story had gone viral. Headlines flashed, "Bus driver saves dozens in downtown brake failure." "Hero at the wheel," "Passengers credit," Darnell Hayes with their lives. City ignored his warnings. Now, they call him a hero. Clips of the teenager's video played on every channel. Commentators marveled at Darnell's calm voice over the chaos, giving orders like a captain in a storm. Social media exploded with hashtags. # hero driver, # thank you Darnell, # saved by Darnell. People who had never ridden Route 27 posted tributes, while passengers flooded comment sections with stories about his kindness, how he always waited an extra second for an elderly woman to sit, how he kept snacks for kids who boarded hungry, how he never lost patience no matter how rude the commuter. The city had tried to frame it as a mechanical issue, but the people had chosen their story. It wasn't about brakes. It was about the man behind the wheel. And for the first time in his 12 years on the job, Darnell Hayes was no longer invisible. He was the name on everyone's lips. By the end of the week, there was no hiding it. The city could shuffle papers, issue bland press releases, and mumble about mechanical failures all they wanted. But the people had already made up their minds. Darnell Hayes wasn't just a bus driver anymore. He was their hero. Still, official recognition came slowly, dragged out like a reluctant apology. It wasn't until the mayor herself was cornered by reporters outside City Hall, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, that the tide finally broke. "Madam Mayor," one reporter shouted, "will the city honor Mr. Hayes for saving dozens of lives?" The mayor adjusted her blazer, lips pursed. "We are, of course, grateful to all our public servants," she said carefully. "Mr. Hayes's quick thinking prevented tragedy. Yes, the city will be holding a ceremony." That one sentence was enough. Within hours, flyers circulated announcing a public event at the downtown plaza. On the day of the ceremony, the plaza was overflowing. Bus riders, families, veterans, even children waving homemade signs crowded the steps. Hand-painted posters bobbed above the crowd. "Thank you, Darnell, our hero driver, Route 27 strong." Darnell stood off to the side of the stage, tugging at the sleeves of his uniform jacket, uncomfortable in the spotlight. He would have preferred being behind the wheel of his bus, doing the job he knew. But Zoe was there, Mrs. Lopez with her groceries, Dre the teenager who filmed the video. Every familiar face from his route had come. The mayor took the podium first, her voice formal. "Today, we honor an employee who went above and beyond in the line of duty. His actions saved lives. Please join me in recognizing Mr. Darnell Hayes." Polite applause rippled, but then something shifted. Zoe stepped forward from the crowd and shouted, "He didn't just save us that day. He's been saving this city every day for 12 years. Cheers erupted. Mrs. Lopez raised her hands and called out, "He listens when no one else does." The chant began almost instantly. "Darnell! Darnell! Darnell!" The mayor, clearly flustered, gestured for him to step forward. As Darnell approached the microphone, Karen appeared near the front row. Her familiar binder clutched tight. She had been whispering all week to anyone who would listen that he had been reckless for driving a bus with faulty brakes, that his so-called heroism was just doing his job. But the moment he began to speak, her words evaporated into nothing. "I don't think of myself as a hero," he said simply. His voice carried across the plaza, steady and unshaken. "I think of myself as a driver. My job is to get people home safe. That's all I've ever wanted. For Mrs. Lopez with her groceries, for Zoe after her long shifts, for the kids with their backpacks, for every passenger who trusts me enough to step onto my bus. That day, when the brakes failed, I did what I had to do. The truth is, I'd been warning about those brakes for months. The city didn't listen, but I couldn't let my passengers pay the price for that silence." The crowd roared, some booing in the direction of City Hall officials, others clapping until their hands stung. Karen's face burned red, her binder hung useless at her side. The mayor, cornered by the force of the people's voice, turned stiffly and presented Darnell with a framed certificate and a medal that caught the sunlight. But the real honor came not from City Hall, it came from the crowd. Children perched on parents' shoulders, chanting his name, while passengers wept openly, clutching each other in gratitude. For once, Darnell wasn't invisible. He wasn't just the driver. He was the man who had been ignored until the moment he proved impossible to ignore, and the city would never forget his name again. The days after the ceremony felt like a different world. Route 27, once just another line on the transit map, became a symbol of resilience. Each morning when Darnell pulled his bus out of the depot, now a brand new vehicle with perfectly tuned brakes, there was already a crowd at the first stop, not just riders, but neighbors waving, shop owners setting out coffee for him, school kids shouting his name. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," a little boy called, saluting like a soldier as Darnell opened the door. "Morning, champ," Darnell replied, smiling wider than he had in years. He had been offered something more than thanks. The transit board, under public pressure, promoted him to senior safety instructor, a role where he could train new drivers, inspect buses, and finally make sure the issues he had been ignored for years would never be overlooked again. For the first time, his voice wasn't just tolerated, it was sought out. Even the city itself began to change. The mayor announced new investments in transit safety, proudly citing lessons learned from Darnell's heroism. Bus stops were upgraded, faulty vehicles retired, maintenance schedules tightened. The same suggestions that once sat in ignored reports now bore his name, but it wasn't the medals or the title or even the headlines that mattered to Darnell. It was the people. Mrs. Lopez, whose groceries no longer rattled nervously on the floorboards. Zoe, who told him she finally slept easier on her way home from the night shift. The school kids, who now treated the morning ride like a tradition, chanting, "Hero driver," whenever he steered past the river. One afternoon, as he parked at the downtown terminal, Dre, the teenager who had filmed the crash, ran up to the bus. "Hey, Mr. Hayes," he said breathlessly, holding up an envelope. "Guess what? They picked my video for the city's safety campaign. They're going to show it at schools." Darnell chuckled, ruffling the boy's hair. "Guess you saved some lives, too." The boy grinned. "Because you showed me how." That night, as the sun set over the city, Darnell walked past his bus, running a hand along its clean frame. For years, he had been invisible, just another man in a uniform, trusted with everything yet recognized for nothing. Now, he wasn't just seen, he was celebrated. He looked back at the plaza, where neighbors still gathered, where a mural was being painted of a bus climbing a hill with the words, "Driven by courage," beneath it. His heart swelled, not with pride, but with quiet gratitude. The city had ignored him. But when the moment came, he had done what he always did. He drove, he protected, he endured. And because of that, dozens of lives were safe, and an entire city had been reminded of the value of the man behind the wheel. For the first time in his life, Darnell Hayes felt the weight of something he'd never carried before. Not invisibility, not silence, respect. And in the reflection of the bus window, he smiled to himself. Guess Dad was right. They see it now.